So this video is going to be a bit different. Ludum 49, one of the biggest game jams there is, recently popped in. If you didn't know, a game jam is an event wherein you have to create a game under a short time frame, usually around 2 to 3 days. And along with the recent release of Fancade PC, which is technically not a PC version but more so a feature that allows you to play the game on the browser, but that's besides the point. Anyways, me and some members from the Fancade Discord server, which you could join by the way by pressing the link in the description down below, thought that it would be a very good idea for us to show the potential of Fancade by participating in the event. But first, what is Fancade? Fancade is an amazing game that allows you to create games on the go through its simple, intuitive, and understandable scripting. And even if you're not particularly interested in making games, the community has made so many creations that offer countless hours of fun while playing. I particularly love this game as it allows me to share my creativity through making tons of games. And just to be clear, this isn't an ad. I know that I'll make it sound that I'm excessively praising the game, so keep in mind that in case that this is actually an ad, I'm going to be much more unnecessarily enthusiastic. But in all seriousness, do check it out since it's really worth playing. Anyways, the theme for this game jam was unstable. And sure enough, some of my friends have created really awesome submissions filled with great mechanics, visuals, levels, and anything in between. Each game also has its own creative interpretation of the theme. And that's partly the reason why I also wanted to hop in, since I wanted to bring something to the table as well. So without further ado, here's how I used Fancade to participate in Ludum 49. My idea was to create an arcade game where you scavenge for food around a market to feed an overly gluttonous king that could explode once you take too long. You might be asking, how does this relate to the theme in any way? Well, the theme is all about being unstable, and the game is all about keeping the king stable by feeding him with food. If you don't meet his needs, he would become very unstable and throw a very explosive tantrum. And you wouldn't want that, would you? This isn't really a creative interpretation per se, but that would do for now considering this is my first time joining the jam. So the first thing that I worked on was the visuals. At first, I wanted the game to be in a 3D environment since I think it would be easier for me to implement movement. But then I realized that would be a massive waste of space for custom blocks, which isn't really optimal. Therefore, I decided to go utilize pixel art. So I started working with how the king would look. I gave the king some white eyes, dark robe, red shoes, if that wasn't enough to tell that this guy is evil. And I had him wear a crown with some green gems, thinking that this was the color of gluttony. Until I did my research and I was very dead wrong about that. Green isn't the color of gluttony, it's orange. The green however represents greed, so let's just roll with that for now. I imagine the king sitting on his throne being all spoiled, grumpy, and some mean king stuff, I don't know. I initially went to create a wooden throne, but I realized wait, the king isn't poor, so I repainted it into something more grand and royal. I started to position the king's assets so that I could visualize how the king would look, and I added some scripting for the head so it would smoothly change its position every now and then, had the crown and eyes follow its movement, and using the sign block, I added some movement with the shoes as well so that they would hover up and down. And before you know it, the evil king looks evil. I mean, listen, I don't know how to tell you, but the guy looks mean. Next thing that I focused on was the player. I also wanted to give him white eyes and a beard for no particular reason, like at all. I created 4 versions of the head, with each facing a specific direction, and the reason why I stacked them together so that it would only count as a single block, which would allow me to squeeze in more blocks in case that I needed to add more objects without hitting the custom block limit. I then created the rest of his body and moved on to the card. You might be asking, wait, where's the hands? I created a wooden cart and used a trick where the bottom part would be 1 voxel higher, so once we put the food there, it would look like it was inside the actual cart. I then proceeded to create the food items for the game. I decided to make a sizable amount of items per food category so I could easily put them near one another. In total, I made around 16 items ranging from meat, fruits, pastries, dairy products, and beverages. Next, I created the actual environment where the player could walk as well as the stalls. And once I'm done with everything else, I decided to start making the gameplay. First, I wanted to make a little intro where the king would come up with 3 different food items for the player to get. I made sure that no food item would be the same to avoid any potential problems, and once I'm satisfied with that, I decided to the player's controls and animation. First, I created a hitbox for the player which would help me later with. Afterwards, I made sure that all the player assets would be visible on play. Then after that, I adjusted the positions of each asset based on which direction the player is facing, which is honestly really painful, but I managed to do it, sort of. Next, I used the Neo joystick as the main control scheme for the game. I also added a slipper effect for the cart to simulate that you're actually pushing a shopping cart, and after many failed attempts, I finally got it working. I also added a border around the world to make sure that the player won't be able to get out. You might be asking, why is the border hidden yet it can still prevent the player from wandering off? I used a block called the late update, which basically means that it would only run once all the physics stuff are processed. That means that every frame, all the borders and hitboxes are visible to make sure that collision would work, and after that, they would be hidden so the player wouldn't be able to see them. After that, I then made a way for the player to collect the food item once they're standing on the square. Implementing that mechanic was fairly easy. I just looped through all 16 stalls, checked the X and Y positions of both the cart and square, and checked if the difference would be less than 1. If that's the case, I used the truth variable to make sure that it would only run once, and created a clone for the food item, which would be attached to the cart itself. The hard part that took me a lot of time to fix was to position the food. I had to implement some kind of Z-sort to make sure that objects wouldn't overlap with each other, and along with the fact that all food items are stacked together so each of them has its own right position, it was hell. Absolute hell fixing it. But nonetheless, I managed to get it working. I then realized that the player could get stuck if they managed to get the wrong food item. In that case, I added a bin at the center of the map which the player could go to and dispose of the item. And once I'm done with the bin, I decided to move on to creating a timer for the game. My idea was to create 2 timers. One would be for the UI, so the player would always see them, and one is practically useless and is only there for purely decoration. At the start, the player would be given 30 seconds to collect items, and each food given would add up to 10 seconds to the timer. Afterwards, I worked on implementing the feeding mechanic. What I did was to check if the player is near the king, and if it is, it would loop through all the 3 food items and check if its ID is equal to the ID of the currently held food item. If it is, it would set hash back to false to make sure that the player can get another food item, sort the food item into a list for me to apply some animations later, and we set the hash variable to avoid any problems. I also made sure to add 10 seconds to the timer and increment the score variable. Next, I made a loop for all the food items to be eaten wherein their positions would smoothly move towards the king's mouth and would run for 1 second before that object is destroyed. I also added the mouth because every important feature of the human body should be seen. Anyways, once the player has fed the king, the game would randomly pick another food item to replace the old order. I also added a losing animation where the king would just become really upset and throw explosions basically everywhere. And it's actually pretty good. The next thing I did was to implement some bubbles to guide the player where the food item is. The idea was that those bubbles would be positioned at the top of the stalls, but they would just remain visible on the screen no matter what. Basically, if you get too far, they would just be at the edge of the screen instead of being gone. Next, I need to make sure that once the food is collected, the bubble would disappear. And once I'm done, I decided to move on. I realized the gameplay is pretty bland, so I decided to add some NPCs that would move around the market. The idea was to spawn NPCs in selected points, and those would use raycast to determine which direction they should be going, as well as to check if they're going to collide with something. Trust me, it was absolutely hell. Not for pretty much everything else, but because I apparently forgot how raycast works, so I spent a lot of time fixing that. But nonetheless, I got it working. Next, I positioned the NPC assets to the actual boxes, similar to how I adjust the position of the player. But this was easier considering that they didn't have a card glued to their skin, so I don't have to do any magical math to determine the accurate positions of each block. I then created another head with a different skin tone, as well as some variations of clothes to give some variety to the NPCs. You might be asking, what purpose does the NPC serve? Well, they would serve as another challenge for the player as they try to find their way to them, since pushing to them would take some time. You might be asking again, wouldn't this just bring a painful playing experience for the user? Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I want them to feel what I've gone through when I was fixing that raycast and the god-awful Z-sword. Anyways, they also stop once the timer is done. That's pretty cool. I also made some changes to the map so it would be more accessible to the player. And finally, I created some relaxing music that is loopable, added some props and some finishing details. And finally, it is done. So this is Lord Glutton. A game where you have to feed your gluttonous king by searching for food around a market filled with annoying people before he ultimately explodes. Overall, I am really proud of the graphics and animations since they look super polished in my opinion. So yes, the concept is pretty basic, the collision is pretty annoying, The NPCs are really scuffed, and the controls aren't necessarily great considering I have to put a disclaimer that the player can only use arrow keys since WASD doesn't work, and the fact that there's not much gameplay. But you know what? I'm proud of it.